So why Buddha talk negatively, or why the Upanishads talk negatively about this, is not that the mind itself is bad, but it's about who needs to control who. Does the mind control you? Do the senses control you? Or you become the master? And in fact, Carl Jung said that beautifully somewhere about how the unconscious mind becomes your master if you allow it to, whereas you need to be the master of the unconscious mind. And that's exactly, he was repeating what the Upanishad truths were.
Welcome to today's webinar, where we are going from mindfulness to mindlessness, or versus, I'm not really sure because my mind is exploding, and that's why I will not be here. But Tracy and Ram are here, and you are in good hands. But before we get started officially, I just wanted to draw your attention to the screen, if you aren't already there. And on the screen, you should see a little poster on Beyond Mindfulness. As luck would have it, and actually we did not plan this webinar and that program together, but the universe conspires in mysterious ways. So as luck would have it, we are launching a brand new mini program this coming Saturday. And it's going to be led by the lovely Tracy, who you see on the panel today. And it's kind of like a full-on version of what this webinar is going to be, and how do you apply it to your personal life, I suppose. But maybe Tracy can give us a quick summary at the end of this session. Long story short, we're launching a new program, 6 weeks, 100 minutes each week on going beyond mindfulness. So if you are interested in learning more about this and working with Tracy, please register. So if you go to coacharya.com/events, you can find Beyond Mindfulness on there and you can register. And this is our it's our pilot program. So we'll learn together. And if any of you need CCE units for whatever reason, you can get those for this program. There is an extra fee because there is an extra evaluation process. And applications to coaching to make sure that you're getting the right things that you need for a CCE certificate. So there's a different cost for that. But I hope to see many of you there. We are starting bright and early, at least for the US, on Saturday. And on that note, I will vanish and work on my mind so that I can be around people today without punching anybody in the face. And I'm smiling through the anger and pain. Tracy and Ram, go for it.
Okay, thanks, Magda. I'm happy that you are smiling through anger and pain. May those subside, so the Buddha said. Okay, okay, let's start with this before Tracy and I start into a kind of a dialogue, answering questions as well from you. Tracy, I, and perhaps Komal is in this group somewhere. Perhaps she is, perhaps she isn't, I'm not sure. Yeah, she is. And with Magda, there was a thread which is going, and perhaps one or two other people. We've been talking about several things, and one of the things that suddenly Tracy sprang upon me were a few very erudite doctoral pop science articles on what might be called the working memory. First, I didn't know what the heck working memory was. And then when I looked it up, it seemed to have been derived from computeries, talking about the flash memory in computers. And essentially what it said was that we all work with memory, working memory of just maybe a few seconds of awareness. And this is a famous theory, which I had known for a long time, that you only remember 7 plus minus 2. If you are given a random set of numbers or facts or figures or whatever it is, and it will be very difficult for you to remember anything more than that. So I started thinking about it, and then fortuitously, like many things happen, and that's one of the questions that we will pose you a little later. I suddenly came upon certain other articles, and this time not pop science, pseudoscience, but real science based on medical research and scientific research, which gave me a few of these facts. And some of this you might have been aware, and you can just Google them and verify. There would be a certain differences in the order of magnitude that I'm talking about because the numbers are huge. Starting with this, the thinking part of the human brain, which you might call the prefrontal cortex, which is about decision making and stuff like that, has approximately, I noted it down somewhere before I forget it, 10 to the power of 10 cells, neurons, bits of memory. And those of you who are familiar with computers, you would know a bit is the on-off switch, and a byte is 8 of them put together so that it forms a letter or a number or some such thing which is meaningful. And this is just that one part, one little part of your prefrontal cortex, and which is roughly equivalent to something like about 10 billion would be it'll be about 10 billion cells or something like that. A billion is 10 to the power of 9, this is 10 to the power of 10. But if you expand it into the whole body, and if you take the cells in your bloodstream, in your muscles, in your sinews, your fascia, and stuff like that, it becomes about 10 to the power of 15. The difference of the power of 5 doesn't seem to be large, but it's exponential. Those of you who are familiar with mathematics, even high school mathematics, would know that 10 to the power of 15 is a huge, 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 huge number, which is more than all the stars and all the galaxies that we can even imagine to think about. And that is just all to start with. And then there is this report said that each cell actually has 1,000 connections, because the cells by themselves have their intelligence. That is how unicellular bodies existed, and they developed into the human beings eventually. So each cell is capable of connecting and normally forms connections of about 1,000, which means that in our body alone, there are total connections of about 10 to the power of 18. That's just within our body. And there was an extension to this article which said, we now know that there are a lot of things which travel from a person to person. It's almost like the quantum entanglement that quantum science talks about. And there are studies called 100 monkey experiments where tricks that were learned by monkeys in a, let's say, land-based mass were transmitted into a water-bounded island monkeys, and they started doing the same tricks without coming ever into contact. So this happens. There is something collective that happens. And very soon we might have about 10 billion people on this planet. It's not going to take very long. At that point in time, you're really talking about something close to about 10 to the power of 30 connected, what you might call a super duper computer in the collective consciousness of humanity. And this is even unbelievable. And with this total in mind, and starting with, let's say, 10 to the power of 10, which is just the prefrontal cortex, to 10 to the power of 18 or 20, which is a total body, to 10 to the power of 30, which is a total human collective consciousness, we still struggle to remember anything more than calculations generally based on anecdotal empirical evidence show that we cannot remember anything more than 100 bits per second. As against what I'm talking about, 10 to the power of 30 bits per second is what could be the total capacity. So I don't have any answers. But what seems to happen is a phenomenon which I would like to go a little deeper into, where we are limiting our own capabilities. We are limiting our immense potential that we are capable of. So now, what I would like to do is ask Tracy to put up this poll for you. I just want you to tell us how many of you have ever experienced this phenomenon where you did not know that it was going to happen, either in the form of a meeting or seeing or getting a mail or an email, whatever it may be, any incident, no clue whatsoever, but you knew somehow that this is likely to happen. This would happen. You might call it intuition, you might call it premonition, you might call it whatever you want. And it happened. How many of you in this audience now of, whatever numbers totally at this point in time you are, 112 people I see, have had this experience? If Tracy, you can just put up that poll, we would like to have a number. Very quickly, please, within the next about 10, 20 seconds. Okay, in what I believe to be Spanish, which is terrible, brillianto, whatever the word is, pretty much 80% of you have said you have experienced it. And about 92% actually of the people who answered, 8% said no, some of you haven't answered. Now, the next question I have for you is, have any of you come across a reasonably valid scientific explanation? And if so, would you be willing to, if I call you on panel, come and share with me what that explanation for this phenomenon is? The second poll, Tracy. No, that has been answered. Do we have the other one? End the poll and then maybe go to the second one.
It should be up now. Yes.
Yeah. Roughly about 3, 4, 5, 6 of you have said, yeah, maybe later if you could put it in the chat who you are, and you are willing to come up and tell me exactly where you read that, what it is, as we go through this, I would be tremendously grateful, because I really would like to learn. Because I haven't yet till today come across, there are all light of pseudo-scientific explanations. But yeah, we can close that, Tracy. Thank you. What I would call pop science explanations, but I haven't found anything which is valid from a scientific perspective. There are theories. There's a theory of entanglement. There is a theory of predictability. There's a theory of something that supports intuition, saying that there is a part in the prefrontal cortex, which is like the third eye, which is there in our Hindu scriptures and so on and so forth, which might be able to do that. And there is a hormone which could probably be created and so on and so forth. A lot of conjectures. And I also have a lot of conjectures. So we will share about some of them, and then we'll try and go deeper into this. My simple hypothesis is this. Most of us, most of the time, are in a state of unawareness. It's almost like, may not be as bad as a guy slouching on a couch, popping corn or whatever garbage into mouth, usually a guy, usually pot-bellied, watching the idiot box, because women have better things to do. And in a total state of unawareness, doesn't even know what the heck is going into your mouth. And it may not be as bad as that, but in many cases, pretty much all of us, men or women, if you're really honest enough to admit, when you are actively thinking or doing something, especially focusing on a job which is repetitive, while you may be doing it locally, your body is there locally, your mind may be elsewhere. This happens to all of us. You are in the office, seemingly working hard, or maybe even talking on the phone, doing something which supposedly requires your cognitive attention. but your mind is completely elsewhere. It's thinking about maybe being at the bar, being at the beach, being with someone you like or not like, whatever it may be. And when you're actually in that place, whether you are at the bar or the beach or wherever, you are supposedly there to entertain yourself, be happy. Then you think about what all that you haven't done at work or somewhere else. So your mind is at one place, your body is at another place. And that is a state of total unawareness. Whatever we might think we are doing and whatever excuses we may think that we have is a total state of unawareness. So at the first level, we need to bring a basic understanding of where we are, localize ourselves, our mind and body together, so that as a total system, as an individual, you are focusing on whatever that you are supposed to do, especially if you are trying to do something which is combining all your faculties of cognitive, emotional, somatic, and everything together. For example, if you're a good coach and you're coaching somebody, the client has excuse to have the body there and the mind elsewhere, whereas the coach has no excuse. The coach has to be completely 100% focused on the client with unconditional positive regard, empathy, and congruence, without which no coaching can really happen. You are no coach if you don't do that. So to make that happen, at the very first level, you need to become mindful. And to that extent, mindful awareness is extremely important for those of us who have trouble in even bringing our mind and body together. What mindful awareness does is essentially ensure that your sensory perceptions, which are primary part of your mind, and all other things which happen within your brain and the rest of the body as a mind, they are in the same place as where you are. So you are in that present moment, which is what we call the present moment. So is your mind and body together? Are you somatically, ontologically, emotionally, and everything else wise? Are you in the same place together as a mind and body? And that is what is mindful awareness. Unfortunately, this term has today been interpreted, and I'll answer any question that you have. I know Tracy has questions about this, to mean things like meditation, vipassana, yoga nidra, and so on and so forth, which is totally false. It's fake news. And I'll tell you why. The word itself was coined by a British civil servant who at that time was in Sri Lanka, who had an inadequate knowledge of Pali, which Buddha spoke, and possibly not even an adequate knowledge of English language, and translated the word that Buddha used to define the 8 pathways to the noble truth, or 4 noble truths, where he used a word called sati, which actually meant memory, and in a negative sense, which is the way that the word sati or the Sanskrit equivalent smriti connote in both the languages that it is conditioned memory, exactly the same way that Freud and Jung described the unconscious mind and the iceberg at the bottom where all our negativities are stored. And that is what actually the word sati and smriti referred to. And when Buddha talked about the right memory as part of the Eightfold Path, he was talking about unconditioning that, getting disengaged from that memory. And that is what he called as the right memory. And suddenly this word, which was negative in the Buddhist Hindu terminology, became a fashionable pop new age guru word, thanks to even some Buddhist priests who should know better. And in fact, in Buddhism, the alternative to this was considered to be the state of sunya that Buddha talked about again and again and again. It means nothingness. It is not the nothingness in a nihilistic sense. It meant the nothingness of the mind and body, sensory perceptions. It meant Purna, which means completeness in terms of energy. And this was practiced in Zen as no mind. And many thousands of years ago, before that in the Upanishads, the Mandukya Upanishad, it was defined as a state of the fourth awareness, the fourth state of awareness called Turiya, which is what, just as to have a bit of fun with everybody, I call mindlessness, just to poke fun at people who talk about mindfulness for no other reason. It's called no mind, which is the right word in Zen. And no mind means that you are in a state of collective consciousness. You are moving away from individual awareness. Of course, you are moving from unawareness, which is totally unacceptable, to a mindful individual awareness, to a state where you are collectively conscious, which means you are in fact increasing, like what I earlier talked about, your capability of 100 bits per second processing capability as an individually capable human being to the 10 to the power of 30 as a collective human consciousness. And believe you me, today people are working on this. This is something which is, at this point in time, it's listed a theoretical assumption, but there are many other things which are coming to support it, like the Stanford research, medical science, which has established that individually itself, we have such a huge capacity if we were to systemically focus our entire attention together. And before I throw it open to Tracy for discussion and yourself, and I'm not talking out of thin air, my brain has been experimented with through biofeedbacks and various other kinds of measurements with brain wave patterns and all kinds of stuff. And I've been a meditator for almost about 30 to 40 years now. Initially, in the early stages when they played on with my brain, put a skull cap on it and measured it with equipment, this was about 20 years ago. The guy asked me to go into meditation and said, I'm taking photographs of you in what is called poly-interference photography, PIP. I didn't even know what it meant. And at the same time, he wired me up to the skull cap and the machines to measure my brain waves. At the end of it, so I asked him, okay, so what the heck is going to happen? So he said, look, these photographs, since you said that you're going to do a healing meditation, and at that time I was practicing very seriously Reiki meditation, along with certain aspects of what today would be called Vipassana Yoga Nidra, which I didn't know at that point in time. And he said, your body will turn green. And I'm telling you ahead, you will see for yourself if you're really doing that. And the second is, if you are going to be meditating, your normal brainwave pattern, at that time what was understood, would have been beta, which is a 12 to 20 hertz cycles per second. The frequency will reduce to somewhere below 12. It may go as deep as 4 if you're really very into deep meditation, but that's what would happen. So at the end of it, 30 minutes, I still have photographs, time-lapse photographs taken over a period of 30 minutes, where at the end of it, with my brown skin, I turned to be an Irishman, all green. So the entire body was green, believe you me. And that was what the photograph showed. So there was no, and it was gradual. I mean, as it happened over every whatever number of minutes, 3 minutes or something, and it was very gradual, except for a few dark spots, which actually showed that there were issues that I had. Some I knew, some I didn't know, which manifested later. And it could have been a very good predictive medical tool as well, as these guys were working and later gave it up for some other ethical reasons. But then said, this is the bad news. You are not meditating, you're just faking. I said, what the heck? You know what? This machine is capable of measuring up to about 25 hertz, and you are right on the top edge. And that is not meditation, buddy. That's You are just like, if you're actively running or doing something or whatever it is, that is what it is. I said, okay, fine. Anyway, I had very, very positive experience with Reiki and other forms of spiritual healing. This was in the year 1990, 1991, around that period. And 1995 to 1997, Dr. Herbert Benson, those of you who don't believe me, please look it up. He was a professor emeritus at Harvard Medical School, one of the greatest researchers on brain, meditation, all that stuff. And he did this work with Tibetan lamas. And he did experiments with these guys who, as novitiates, were put into the first entry into monkhood. Naked, they would go and sit in ice, and they would wrap a wet towel around them, freezing. And within a certain period of time, I don't remember exactly what, a few minutes time, they have to raise their body temperatures at least by 10 to 20 degrees, and that cloth should dry. And if they did that, they would pass. And believe you me, everyone did that. The Buddhist monks go through these kind of practices. And he found that he measured the brain waves, and they were going over the roof. So they had to create new measurement techniques. And he found these were around 30 to 40 hertz, about 40 hertz usually. So I went back to these guys. They were still in business. They were doing something else. And I said, look, this is what I hear. Do you have the equipment? And they didn't, but they helped me find a place. And when I did my meditation, at that time, I had already done Vipassana. I had started practicing from Yoga Nidra. And I did that. The needle hit 40. And at that state, truly, you experience something else. Because while doing Vipassana, I went through these experiences where I completely lost my mind and body. All that I could find was that I was an energy being. It's very difficult to express, and I can't express it in any way that people can understand, which is why beautifully the Upanishads say, who have experienced that state will never be able to express, and who express it would have never experienced it. Because I have read a lot of people who have talked about this, and some of those practices are extremely dangerous. And I had tried to practice it earlier, and I landed in a lot of trouble. So I would caution anybody who is trying to do any of that stuff. But there are ways of attenuated methodologies using practice like Vipassana, Yoga Nidra, and shorter processes that we will do as part of this series. I am quite open to conducting a meditation session if sufficient number of you are interested, and you can experience it for yourself. Believe you me, this is one of those things that cannot be taught, but can be learned. There's a huge difference between the two. It is just like music, it's just like painting, just like dancing. No one can teach you. They can only guide you through certain things, but it has to be something very innate that you will have to learn by yourself. So I'm going to stop here. I've talked long enough. I didn't want to this long, but I needed to cover whatever I want to put a base around. So Tracy, over to you for questions, and if there are anything in the chat box that you might like to refer to me, because there are a huge number of things out there.
Thanks, Ram. Yeah, I think you summed it up all very beautifully. The problem, as you said, is that mindfulness has become such an umbrella term and it's being used to refer to many practices that, as you explained, don't make sense with the definition of the word. I wanted to ask you maybe to address what practice, if any, of meditation that mindfulness in the proper understanding of the word would refer to.
Mindfulness?
Yes.
Maybe. Look, point is I'm biased, okay? The word mindfulness refers to a sensory awareness. The 101 exercise in mindfulness is about taking a raisin or a piece of cut lime, lemon, and you look at it, you sniff it, and By the time, even before you put it into your mouth starts salivating. So it creates all the sensory experiences, which are the first things that happen in the mind. That's the brain. The first receipt of information is through your sensory perception. So either the visual or the auditory, with the two fundamental ones, the kinesthetic, the third, and then the taste and the smell. Now, as long as the senses are active, the mind is active. And we are controlled by the senses. We are controlled by the mind. So why Buddha talk negatively, or why the Upanishads talk negatively about this, is not that the mind itself is bad, but it's about who needs to control who. Does the mind control you? Do the senses control you? Or you become the master? And in fact, Carl Jung said that beautifully somewhere about how the unconscious mind becomes your master if you allow it to, whereas you need to be the master of the unconscious mind. And that's exactly, he was repeating what the Upanishad truths were. So if you, even those of you who know a bit of yoga, and you know quite a bit of it, and if you practice what is called the eight-limbed yoga of Patanjali description, the things that we do normally as a physical exercises of asanas and pranayama are called external manifestations of yoga. And there are 4 limbs which are called internal manifestations of yoga. The first step in the internal yoga starts with a process called pratyahara, which actually means disengaging yourself from the senses. That's the first part. And then you move into 3 parts, which are dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, which are called samyama, together integrating, which frees the mind, which makes the mind mindless, which makes the mind a no mind, at which point in time you get total mastery over the mind. And that is what the essence of meditation is. Therefore, if someone says mindful meditation, it's an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. It cannot exist. Because the first thing you have to let go is the control of the senses. You have to disregard the senses. But ironically, the pathway to that is to focus first on the senses and thoughts and so on, which is why there's a lot of confusion. Whether it is yoga, whether it is vipassana, whether it is Zen, you start with the breath awareness, you start with the body awareness, and then you start with the experiential awareness in the mind. And when you go through this, it looks like as if I'm doing mindful meditation. But these are the pathways for you to free yourself. If you stop there, then you stay there. The mind is still in control. And you would forever be in control of that mind. So if you want to call that meditation, which is not true, you can call it meditation. But the real, any of the people here, I don't know, I should have done a poll, how many of you have done Vipassana out here? And if you really do the Vipassana properly, suddenly you come to this point after about 5-6 days out of the 10 days. It takes time. You completely break away from the sensory perceptions. You completely break away from your thoughts. And you are completely free. And it's not a state that just comes to you anytime that you wish. I had to struggle for 10 to 15 years before I was able to get to a stage where I could develop it into a process to be able to do it. And then suddenly you are in that zone where you can control. So the difference between the two is this. When you are in mindful meditation, however much you practice, like Magda was saying, I'm going to explode, I'm angry, it's a father, but she's very, very angry. You can't control. That wave pattern that happens in your mind, it takes a long time before it settles down. With forced meditation, counting to 100, breathing, all that kind of a stuff, you can manage it. That's all you can do. You can manage it. But in order for you to remain at that state of tranquility, almost like a flatliner, of course, if it's a flatliner, you are dead, but pretty much close to that, you would need to be in that state of mindlessness. So coming back to what you said, I know that mindful meditation is a very, very popular word, and it's today extraordinarily pop science, and you know that you have done that work. You sent me the links, and we can share with the group if they require that. Mindful meditation or mindfulness, in fact, increases your stress levels because it makes you more sensory. And people can be driven to suicide. I mean, this has been established because it makes you, many of these people who do this are so egoistic. They are not willing to consider anything else. It becomes a cult. And that's a classic sign of the self-destruction process that happens with many of these cults, like be it the one about the secret, the one about Dianetics, and so on and so forth. This is another cult which is going to self-destruct itself. Because if you stick to it, saying that, yes, mindfulness works to make you more sensorily aware, bring you from total unawareness into awareness, I'm all for it. That's exactly what it does, and which is fantastic. It is like a completely ignorant, illiterate person at least being able to learn the alphabets and the basic 3 R's and so on and so forth. There's a great purpose to it. But beyond that, if you really want to go into a state which is, let's say, applying it to coaching, and you want to sit in front of somebody and you do not want to be, I mean, this, Komal is here, she can tell you yesterday, day before yesterday, she was covering this with the EMCC and ICF competencies, where how do you stay away from being emotionally involved in the emotions of the client? How do you remain non-judgmental and still with unconditional positive regard? At that point in time, you need to be mindless. Even that empathy has to be, it's like, I don't know, you probably, if Cindy were here, she used to use this example when somebody was coaching her and she told that person, you know what's happening here? I'm in the well, sitting down, fallen down, and I'm seeking help. Pull me out, pull me out. And so pulling me out, you also get into the well and come down and sit by the side of me. And it's not helping either of us. Both of us are stuck. That is sympathy. Whereas in empathy, if you really want to be disengaged in helping, you put out a hand or put down a rope or call somebody for help and you pull the other person out. So you need to be non-judgmental in terms of your empathy, not judgmental, disengaged, detached. So this fourth state, the definition is witnessing, detached, disengaged observation. So when you are part of an experience, like for example, even now, parallelly, there is a meta cognition of emotions and thoughts that is going on, that I'm not the speaker, I'm watching myself speak. And that, if you're able to get to that state, then the energy body through which you are communicating is distant from the physical body through which you are communicating. Many of us have experienced this. There was a person who, she may not be here today, but she was saying in the class, explaining to somebody, when someone's saying, oh, it's so difficult to be silent and be able to communicate in coaching. She said, no, I find it's very easy. And that is when I can communicate the best. Because you are moving away from a conversation, moving into a communication to communion. You don't have to say anything. You are in the space of collective consciousness. And your inner dialogue is not biasing what you're saying. So I'll stop here. I mean, you asked a simple question, is there something called mindful meditation? Unfortunately, no. Meditation means the word dhyan in meditation, by definition, is one in which you go beyond thoughts. You use the anchor of a thought first, because that is why you use a mantra. But eventually, the process is to move beyond thoughts into that state of samadhi, which is disengagement. And that is what is true meditative state.
So thinking of that in terms of a metaphor, by staying mindful, you're almost sitting down there with the anchor and you're not moving beyond.
True. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. You are self-anchoring yourself or tying yourself. It's like, there was a famous, I mean, it's beautiful. What you said was really beautiful. There's a very famous mystic who died quite some time ago, a great saint called Ramakrishna. He once explained this. He said, you're all like, a cow which is tied to a stick, and all that you can go is round and round. The periphery of your sensory perception. You're not free. And that is what is holding you. That rope, your senses, and that circle that you draw is your mind, and you are there. And if you want to break free, sever that rope, pull out the stake, and move out of that anchor. Then you can roam free. So what you used is an absolutely powerful metaphor, which has been used by one of the greatest saints of India. So anything there in the chat box that is?
Yeah, so I'm just looking at it from most recent, and I'll scroll up, but where does pranayama fit in? The mindful awareness meditation or actual meditation?
Pranayama is very much a mindful meditation, mindful pathway to meditation. It's part of the outer, which is called the Bahiranga Yoga, which is the outer codes of conduct, which is called yama. Niyama is daily practices. The third is asana, which is the posture. Fourth is a pranayama. They go up slightly in the subtlety, but it's very, very, very much a sensory practice, which is why many people are confused. It's a breath awareness, which is very important. You need to be aware of your breath. I start all my meditative practices with breath awareness. Then you go into body awareness. Then you go into experiential awareness of the mind. And then, once you've really mastered it, you don't have to even do anything. You just keep doing it, and suddenly, boom, you're out there. You have lost yourself, and you go into that state of mindlessness, which is the last 4 states of yoga, called the Antaranga Yoga or the inner yoga. Start with pratyahara, and then it goes into something called dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. I'm using the Sanskrit words. There are no equivalent English words, but those put together mean meditation. Yeah. Yeah, someone says pure witness state is taken as an action. Yeah, that's just true. This is, I mean, look, it can be both, right? Which is why, like I was saying, when I was put through the brain waves, and today there are fMRIs and so on, which can do a much better job. In fact, I volunteered myself as a guinea pig. Hope these people respond to me. If you are inactive, you are in what is called a tamas state of sloth, ignorant, unaware state, a guy who's slouching on a couch kind of a stuff. Then you would be somewhere in the low beta range, not even active. And that is the inactive part. Whereas if you are going to be inactive, if you're going to be in that state of active inactive, if you want to call it that way, then you are going to be in a gamma state. But you can also be in a relaxed state, which is the traditional, when you are still doing your mindful meditations. Even TM, for example, is really mindful meditation in some senses. It leads to mindlessness. And that is what Maharishi Mahesh Yogi taught. But most people are just using that mantra. They become addicted to the mantra. You are still stuck within that sensory perception. So you are still within that range of what you might call it as inactive activity. So yeah, these are very, I mean, honestly, Mon, I mean, this is where the whole problem is. Unless you are able to experience it, there's no point in talking about it. It's just a waste of time for me to keep talking about it. Because once you are experiencing it, when you are in that state, things happen. Like, for example, Tracy sent me an article. I started thinking about it, working on it. And as I walk in the morning, I get into a state where thoughts flow. And suddenly I come back. Someone somewhere, some news item, something pops up. And this is about this article in Stanford. So there's something that opens up for you. You don't even work at it. Do you call it inactive? Maybe. I call it collective consciousness. because there are billions of minds at work which sort of influence you in some way. That's the only way that I can explain. And I don't think science says today any valid scientific explanation as yet. I am sure quantum science would, but probably not yet. Anything else? Sorry. Yeah.
I think this last question here almost speaks to what you were just saying. What are the possible ways in which the meditative practice show up in one's way of being and doing?
What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a short answer to that. I just notice myself noticing a lot more. And so where at one point when I first started meditating, and that meditation was definitely more the mindful type, I was on breath awareness, I was using a mantra. I would find that if I was in a particular situation, I would try to excuse myself to go and meditate to almost kind of cope. Whereas now I can be within the situation to some part. I'm by no means perfect. I wouldn't call myself that by any stretch of the imagination. But I can become aware of what's happening within my body. I can become somewhat separate from that. And then I can actually try from that perspective to connect to the other person and feel a common bond with them, so that I'm no longer sort of seeing ourselves, seeing us as being apart, if that makes sense, and different. And I wish I could tell you that happens every single time. It doesn't. But it's becoming a more and more accessible thing to me as I continue to practice and reflect.
Absolutely, Tracy. It will never happen continuously, believe you. For people like you and I mean, we are living with our feet firmly on the ground. I mean, if you are a kind of a mystic like Ramana, Ramakrishna, or someone like that, and you could just be there and nothing matters, and things happen despite, then you could be always in that state. But for people like us, whatever you have to do to earn a living, do something, whatever it is, you can still be in the being state. This is what the question was. But while being in the being state, you expand yourself from the individual awareness to a larger collective consciousness, where you become more aware of not only what my wants are, but what are the needs of other people as well. And how can I reach out? And this has been there in pretty much a lot of the Western science practices, be it the Jungian collective consciousness, which is unconsciousness, which is basically collective consciousness. If you were to read, and I can work on it for hours together, the archetypes and the metaphors and self, persona, all that kind of a stuff. Or whether it is Maslow's, the fifth level of sex actualization, or the DILP model, finding a purpose, or core transformation by Connie Ray Andreas. There are many of these kind of things which they have worked on it for their own self-awareness, and they have entered into this space of what you might call, for a better, want of a better word, the systemic collective consciousness. And it's not always easy. So you keep moving in and out of it. But the point is, once you have a glimpse of it, you never forget it. So you realize when you are in that state, and then when you keep practicing, and that is what in the next week can take you through this process. Of course, you need to work on it for quite some time till you internalize it. And all that you have to do is to lie down or even sit and get into a state of expansion where your individual expands into collective. And someone here mentioned about the Ashtavakra Gita, which is a phenomenally powerful scripture. But you don't have to go that far. It's very subtle. It's very esoteric, Ashtavakra Gita. It's not easy to understand. But in every Veda, there are 4 Veda in Hindu scriptures. Each one of them is condensed into one sentence. It's called the Mahavakya, the great saying. And they are then expanded into the Upanishads. And surprise, surprise, all the 4 in the 4 Vedas and all the Upanishads say exactly the same thing. That you are indeed the universe. There's no difference between your energy and that of the universal energy. You are just a holographic fragment of that, and you have exactly the same powers if you so wish to. Which is why then I come back to this 10 to the power stuff that we talk about. That limited capability which we are imprisoning ourselves into is capable of expanding into the 10 to the power of 30. It's in our hands. You may never reach the 10 to the power of 30, doesn't matter. But you're no longer bound by saying, hey, I'm stuck with my working memory. You're not. You have a lot more. Provided you disengage yourself, which then comes back to some of the basic truths of what Buddha said, is about we are imprisoning ourselves with our greed and fear and those kind of emotions. And those bind us into that narrow shell. When you break free of it, break the wheel of ignorance, then you get into that state where you accept whatever that happens to me is fine. And whatever we believe we are controlling is something that we are really controlling, to some extent perhaps. And which then comes back to the very famous saying in the Gita, which is about our nature is to act as human beings. You cannot avoid it, whatever you do. However, whatever your actions are, don't get obsessed with the outcome. Look at the journey, not the destination. Enjoy yourself doing what you have to do. And therefore, the only way that you will become a great coach is by enjoying your being a coach. Enjoy your process of not knowing. Everybody wants to think that I'm going to add value to the client. By thinking that you're going to add value to the client, that I'm going to solve the client's problem, you're not going to help the client at all. But if you just listen to the client with unconditional positive regard and empathy and congruence and respond in a way not knowing what's going to happen, purely from in response to what the client is saying, that is when mastery of coaching happens. And that is really where I keep saying this to all of you, that you need to be a mindless coach. It's only part fun. It's really truth. You can't be a mindful coach. If you're a mindful coach, you'll be constantly be looking for solutions. You can be a mindful mentor, but you cannot be a mindful coach. Okay, what else?
We have something in the Q&A. Is it possible when and if we connect to collective consciousness, we can access knowledge or information we did not have earlier?
Yes. Knowledge and information that we didn't have earlier. Is that what it is? Yeah.
Yes.
Strangely, however, I look at it slightly differently. When you are in collective consciousness, you're no longer looking for knowledge. You're looking for wisdom. There's a huge difference. To me, knowledge by itself, like that once I said to you, knowledge is dangerous. Knowledge in the hands of the wrong person can be as bad as a knife in the hands of a fanatic. Wisdom is what we should aspire for. When you are in collective consciousness, you have the wisdom. You know what to do. And of course, you have the knowledge as well. But it's not knowledge as, hey, this is a skill that I can use, this 2 bits of information I can use. But you also understand, this is how I connect the dots. Wisdom is really connecting the dots by bringing the knowledge into a much larger, holistic, systemic overview. And it's also in some ways, it's like very often, I was fortunate in studying logic at one point in time in my life. It's a difference between what might be called deductive logic and inductive logic. Deductive logic is you start with some basic assumptions and you keep coming down. And you can make some horrendous, idiotic, fake truths out of it. Yeah, if you have 2 eyes and you have 1 nose and 2 ears and you have 4 limbs, then you are a human being. So is a monkey, so is a squirrel. So if you were to feed that information into a computer, the computer would look at pretty much every 4-legged creature, which has got 2 eyes and a nose and 2 ears or something like that, into a human being. And that is the limitation of what knowledge is, what deductive logic is. Whereas a wisdom is a discrimination to be able to figure out what is beyond that. It is inductive logic. So what you really do is to pick up pieces of information and you connect the dots together and you raise them to a higher level of an inference. And so many of these things, if you look at it, you move from the individual to the collective. You move from the individual to the systemic. And which is, again, the reason why I'm evangelical, Coacharya is evangelical about systemic approach. Because at best, coaching can only help you in individual awareness, individual consciousness, even if you look at it from a systemic perspective. But when you truly make it systemic, when you start working with multiple people and putting them together, something really powerful starts happening. It's not 1 + 1, 12 times is not 12, it's 120, it's 1,200, it's 12,000. It could be God knows what. It's that interconnectedness that makes a huge difference. So yeah, let's stop here. I mean, this is a subject which one can go on and on. So what ideally we would like to do is next month at the same time, you and I can have, and by that time you would have had your program as well. And let me know in one of your sessions, I'll be quite happy to come and join and take some of the questions. And I'll take people through meditative technique for about maybe between 30 and 45 minutes, in that range. I don't know when, what at that time happens, I have no idea, but between 30 and 40 minutes roughly, which is a combination of Vipassana, Yoga Nidra, and stuff like that, which actually would go through these various states of postural awareness, breath awareness, body awareness, mind experiential awareness, and finally into a state of mindless consciousness if you let yourself go. That part of it depends on the individual. It doesn't depend on me. I can guide them into it. So I would invite everybody who is here and more to come for that program as well. And after that, I'm quite happy to have 1 more session or 2 more sessions. Whatever questions arising out of it, if people can send them across, I'll be quite happy to answer within my limitations of my knowledge base, wisdom base, whatever it might be. Because there are a lot of things, I mean, don't think, honestly, I know nothing. It's something which comes up, and bit what I have learned. A lot of it is experiential, but each of you can think about it and create much more than what I'm talking about at this point in time. Thank you.